Welcome into the Irish NFL show as we continue our look at the NFC conference. In this particular episode, we are going to focus on the NFC East, a division close to my heart. And before we kick off, just want to welcome our host, Colin Cronin, the CNC now. We used to have an M&M, now it's CNC. It's Colin Cronin and Conor Brophy. Guys, great to have you here again today.
Thanks, Brian. CNC Football Factory.
Yeah, we're another step closer to proper regular season football, Brian, which is always good. The sooner that arrives, the better.
And before we start, I just want to say, Conor, we had a fantastic reaction to you being on the show last week. The podcast numbers and people were very, complimentary of the show last week, and obviously you've been involved, so it's great. That's great to hear as well.
That's all down to you guys and how warmly welcomed and propped up I was last week. Very, very flattered to hear that. That's great.
Right, we'll crack on NFC East and the Commanders. We're going to start with the Commanders because they are a precarious one in a way, because I suppose their season and I suppose their off season has been overshadowed by the takeover. You know, I said to Colin when we were in Arizona, I generally couldn't see a scenario how Ron Rivera would still be the coach of this team if it wasn't for all the stuff that's going on off the field. And they haven't done a huge amount in the off season in terms of free agency acquisition, kind of locked up some of their key players. And obviously, Howell has been confirmed as the quarterback. And a lot of people were surprised that they weren't in the sweepstakes for a number of quarterbacks, but they seem comfortable with what they believe they've seen for him in practice of last season, and obviously the game which he played in the final week of the season for them to progress with him. I'll come to you first, Colin. Are you surprised initially if they didn't go after a quarterback? I know they have had a little bit of a quarterback merry-go-round with Taylor Heineke now moving on to Atlanta, but they didn't really do anything in that situation. They're confident with Sam Howell.
Well, I think, Brian, the new owner probably played a big factor in that. You know, we all know about Dan Schneider and his horrific stewardship of the Washington Commanders, both on and off the field. And I can't imagine he was willing to shell out, because the money, we all know, like essentially that a lot of the money essentially either has to be paid up front or held in escrow. So it would have been his money, and he wasn't going to do that. In terms of how, look, he was a decent college QB, and he was probably a better college QB potentially than Kenny Pickett. Now, that's not to say he'll go on to have a better NFL career, but we just don't know. And so I can understand, I suppose, them rolling the dice, especially with the new owners coming in. It allows them to get a season under their belt before they have to make a decision. You don't want to end up in a situation like the Waltons, where you have a QB with a $250 million contract and it's something of an albatross around their neck. So I think for that reason, it probably, makes sense. And they will have weapons there. They did get the contract done with Scary Terry. And look, this is kind of a tread water season. There could be huge changes, both, in the front office and in the head coach this time next year. And obviously Chase Young is the other one. At the time of recording, he was out on the field today, a brace on the knee. But I don't know, does he feel confident in playing on it? He's never looked the same ever since the surgery. So that's the big question mark, I think, going into this season alongside the quarterback.
Conor, Eric Bieniemy has come in as the offensive coordinator. A number of changes across the division. It's an interesting one, bearing in mind his relationship in Kansas City. And we saw at times it looked like his relationship with Patrick Mahomes was starting to dwindle a little bit towards the end. And there was always a conversation that Andy Reid was the one essentially doing all the play calling, albeit he was the offensive coordinator. He's going to get a fresh look at it in Washington. You were thinking he'd have full ownership of the offense.
Yeah, and you mentioned the key word there, which is play caller. And we've seen this happen before, and you're always slightly nervous when a guy goes from that OC position where he's not the chief play caller into a position where suddenly the spotlight falls on him. And that can go in either direction. I'm a Bears fan here, and I'm scarred by the Matt Nagy experience when it turned out that despite being from the Andy Reid coaching tree, he wasn't the next beautiful offensive mind, or at least couldn't translate that into the plays he was calling on the field. And we've also seen Nathaniel Hackett make the transition to the Seattle Seahawks, and that didn't work out too well either. Like it's one thing to be the OC, it's another thing to call the plays, and it doesn't always translate. Now, set against that, Bieniemy's a long time waiting to get this shot, and it's great that he's actually the deputy head coach as well, I think, isn't he? That's the position they've given him. Otherwise, they couldn't have poached him quite as easily, so they needed to give him the bump up. A lot of controversy over the years as to why it was that Bieniemy never got that head coaching job. Never mind, the gig that he's got in the Washington Commanders. And unfortunately, given the history of the NFL and the history of black head coaches in the NFL, there's been a lot of comment on that as well, particularly when you consider some of the other people who got their shots at times when they wouldn't have had anything like the glittering CV that Bieniemy had. So I think a lot of people will be hoping that does take off for Washington next year, even though, all being clear, being honest, it's not the greatest slot in the world, right? For all the reasons the column has just outlined. We've seen the Snyderverse implode, and unlike its movie counterpart, we won't be seeing any fan campaign for it to be reinstalled anytime soon. It's probably the last chance saloon for Riverboat Ron, who, I think is something of a fan favorite well outside Washington, and he deserves better than this. You look at where the Commanders finished up last year. You're 8-1 in what is arguably the toughest, or was the toughest division in football last year. Sent 3 teams to the playoff, and they were still right in with a shout right to the end of the season without anything like the talents that the 2 of the teams ahead of them in that division, the Cowboys and the Eagles, had to call on. So he's done a good job there without a huge amount of help, with all this off-season and off-field turmoil, which obviously hasn't helped from the recruitment perspective. They're kind of stalled in a bit of a strange holding pattern here. Clearly didn't want to make a big move in the draft. Not necessarily a free agent friendly zone for any quarterbacks that were available. Like, who would want to go into that situation not knowing who the GM, who the head coach are going to be next season, not knowing what the new ownership are going to want to do? And as you say, Colin, they don't necessarily want to be in a situation where they've handed out a massive contract, and then new owners come in and have really different ideas about how they want to run the franchise. So you'd expect the Commanders to be competitive as it goes, because players played for Ron Rivera. He's your classic football guy. He's the kind of guy that players want to play for, and he does get results. We've seen the Dan Campbell show for the last couple of seasons. Ron Rivera has been that guy for years, and you'd expect them to go out and play hard, as they always do, but they're up against it.
Talking about contracts there, Darren Payne, massive player, defensive tackle for them, got the big contract in the off-season column, and then they go first-round cornerback, second-round cornerback. So are you looking at this team essentially thinking, if we can shore up our defense, we'd have a chance with the offense in which we have? Because they have brought in some good players over the course of the last few years from the rookie class that have done quite well offensively. Is it defense where the biggest work is needed, do you think?
I suppose if you go back a few years ago, it was defense that they kind of shone on. And ever since then, they've had the struggles on offense, but they probably needed to retool. And we know that, look, the trench warfare is key in any across all the divisions, but possibly particularly this division. This division has such a kind of a storied history. Like, go back when I first started watching it, the NFC East in the late 80s, early 90s was the division. You generally, you came through this and you won the Super Bowl. And the Washington Commanders were serious business back in the 80s, and they wanted to get back there. And I think probably for them, they probably looked at where they were in this particular draft, and it made sense. And we've talked about it a number of times before, Brian. We seem to be in something of a golden age for young cornerbacks. So maybe they're hoping to take advantage of that. And they've also had a bit of success recently with guys who are maybe on the smaller side. If you go Dotson last year, a guy who would have been, not your kind of typical size for a wide receiver, but he had a lot of success, and maybe they're trying to replicate that again in terms of some of their choices in the backfield.
Yeah, and if Hell doesn't work out, they obviously have Jacoby Brissett, who they signed the free agent to step in and take on that familiar role, which he seems to have had over the past few years, which is to back up with an opportunity to play during the season. think the Commanders right now are a bit of an up and down situation, and we're not entirely sure what we'll see from them come September, week 1 against the Cardinals. I'd imagine they'll be happy with that game and look to kick off the season with a win. Moving on to the third team in this division last year, who did make the playoffs, who did win a playoff game in Minnesota, and then obviously fell well short when they played the Eagles, and that is the New York Giants. And the one thing I would say about the Giants this year is there hasn't been any radical changes as opposed to previous years with not just head coaches, but offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators. They've managed to hold on to every coaching staff in which they had. There was numerous different interviews for Kafka, the offensive coordinator. Even Wink Martindale got in on the action interviewing for the coach quite a few times, and it was a big relief for most Giants fans to see that the transition is still in place. Brian Dable obviously doing a fantastic job last year, along with GM Joe Shane, who we were fortunate to have on the show. I suppose the big storyline for this offseason, I guess, would be the Daniel Jones stroke Saquon Barkley scenario, because one was going to get tagged and was going to get the contract. In the end, it played out that Daniel Jones got the contract. And I remember speaking to Colin in January where the 30 million marker was put down. Then it was 35, and then before we knew it was up to 40, and he got that contract in the end. I see the reasons, the rationale behind it, because I didn't think there was anything else out there that would fit into what Dable wants to do offensively. We saw last year, and much improved Daniel Jones. But I still agree with most people that the question marks are still out there for him. They didn't do a lot in free agency. I'll come to you, Connor. We touched on it last week, albeit briefly, the Darren Waller trade, third round pick. Excuse me. I mean, when he's fully fit and functioning, he's arguably one of the best tight ends in the league. It's a big upgrade on what the Giants have had.
Yeah, he is a specimen as well. Like, he's an unbelievable condition, as you say, when he's fit, and when he's 6'6", he runs like a deer for a guy that size, and what a weapon to have at your disposal, in addition to the other weapons as you've already outlined. I mean, the thing about Daniel Jones as well is I have a fondness for him because I just think he's a big time player. Like, is he the best quarterback in the league? No, I don't think we're fooling anybody by trying to advance that argument. But when he needed to, he showed up in the playoffs, won a playoff game at his first attempt. There's a lot of great quarterbacks, a lot of Hall of Fame quarterbacks who didn't manage that feat. They were completely overmatched against the Eagles. I don't think anything that happened that day particularly reflects badly on him. You like to see guys who step up when the moment calls for it. And so far in his career, he's shown that he's able to do that. I place a lot of stock in that. If you go back to, remember Bill Belichick being asked this back in the days when there was, and you'll be familiar with this argument, there was the debate over whether Eli Manning actually belonged in the Hall of Fame, even though he'd won 2 Super Bowls, because you had to look at the stats and you looked at the regular season career. Belichick said, look, the definition for me of a Hall of Fame player is the guy that shows up in the big moments, in the biggest games, when his team need him the most. And Jones looks like one of those players to me from what we've seen. I'd be kind of excited if I was a Giants fan going into this season. I think Daboll is their X factor. He's just a great coach, and what he's shown last year, again, with far from the most talented outfit in the league is, and again, as we've already outlined, in a very tough division, you can get them moving in the right direction. It's not going to be easy for them, but I think what they've done well. Like, signing Jones was the right thing to do, or with the contract that they've given, it's not crazy money, given where he is and given what else was available or what wasn't available. To your point, they'll have Saquon for the next season. They had to franchise tag him in the circumstances. I think that was the only option for them. They've added another big weapon in Waller. They're in decent shape on the other side of the ball as well. I think I'd be modestly excited going into this season if I was a Giants fan.
Got him, not only Waller, but Paris Campbell picked up in free agency. Jalen Hyatt in the draft. I know he's third round. People thought he might go late first, early second. Hasn't played a snap in the NFL yet, so the jury obviously will be out. But like, they're doing their utmost to put weapons around them, and they brought in a running back within the draft. Saquon obviously will have to play on the tag. But are you as confident as, say, Connor is? I know you have your question marks and still do over Daniel Jones.
Yeah, I wouldn't be nearly as confident or complimentary of the Giants' approach. And I say that as somebody who really likes Brian Dable and what Joe Shane has done in his time there. But I see what you're saying, right? I see there wasn't a whole lot out there. And I get it from Dable and Joe Shane's perspective. You don't want to take a step back. But ultimately, they now have a guy who they're paying more than Kirk Cousins. And the question has always been, like, with Kirk Cousins, Florio talks about purple purgatory. my concern for the Giants with Daniel Jones is you put yourself in that category where, yeah, you might get to the playoffs and you go to the wild card round and you win that, but are you going, past the division round? Are you going to a conference championship? Are you taking yourself out of the sweepstakes? Look, they backed him for 2 years, ultimately given the dead cap that they would have to take. The Giants don't seem, and the Maras don't seem like the team you love just down the road, who are willing to eat that dead cap and move on. So I think Daniel Jones would have to have an extraordinarily poor year for them to move on. To me, they're kind of humstrung themselves. Like, I think there's a considerable ceiling ultimately on what they can do. The other part of it for me, yeah, they have brought in weapons, but like the Giants, one of the reasons Connor is right in that they didn't have a chance against the Eagles last year, but one of the reasons they didn't have a chance against the Eagles is because they couldn't stop the run. The Eagles just ran all over the Giants time and time and time again. They weren't the only team that did that. And I worry that the Giants haven't done enough to address that. That would be my concern. I did think it was interesting. This week we're recording it. Heard that Frazier was on his sabbatical from the Bills. Let's see if he goes back there next year. But he spent time with the Giants, and we know the connections that he has, given the personnel that are in the front office and on the coaching staff there. That was an interesting move, shall we say. But to me, yeah, I think there are serious question marks around, just how far this Giants team. They'll be super competitive. We know that Dable will have them there. But I think to me, the divisional round is the ceiling for this Giants team.
Colin touched on how we couldn't stop the Eagles, and that was a big issue last year. They couldn't stop the run. They've done their utmost, I guess, to try and correct that with two key signings in the offseason defensively, Okereke from the Colts linebacker and Robinson, defensive tackle, who won a Super Bowl with the Rams. I suppose it's one of those situations most Giants fans are reasonably confident going into the season because of what's been done to move on from the roster which you had last year. I'm going to make a bold statement now in what are we, June? I usually make those crazy statements in September. Daniel Jones has a better season than Aaron Rodgers next season. Book it in now. But again, I don't know what that will mean in terms of touchdowns, but we'll see. I'll probably come back and pull that one back come September. Anyway, that's my bold statement for this division. Moving on to the Cowboys, and I mean, we look at the Cowboys, and I think we spoke briefly about it previously offline, how they go and play the 49ers 2 years in a row in the playoffs, and both games have such crazy endings. The one the previous year where they couldn't get the snap off to spike the ball to kick the field goal, and then this year where they have Zeke Elliott essentially been the center on the final play of the game. But to me, that felt like a game in the playoffs that the Niners didn't play well. The Cowboys had their opportunities, and it just didn't materialize. And I think there's a sense from Cowboys fans, and speaking to some of the beat writers in which we've had on over the course of the last few months, that they feel they're very close. And I think it's kind of reflective of what they did. They didn't make any massive free agency signings, but they do go out and trade for Gilmore and they trade for Cooks, two players that you would expect with the experience they have to make an immediate impact. I'll go to you, Conor, first. Would you see that's a fair reflection that the Cowboys should feel like they're closer than other teams to be challenging the Eagles and maybe pushing on again?
Well, I was smiling when Colin said that the ceiling for the Giants was the divisional round, because the ceiling for the Cowboys obviously and infamously has been the divisional round. Is it 7 straight times that they've gone to the playoffs now and lost in the divisional round, which is an indictment of their coaching and their culture, frankly, because that should not be the ceiling for a team with this talent. I mean, if you swapped in Dayball for McCarthy, I think they make a Super Bowl run. Simple as. Like, they just... I mean, and you said it, when they end up with Zeke Elliott in for that crazy play last year, you just wonder, what are we doing here? Like, with all that you have around you, and dropping in Brandon Cooks in now into that wide receiver core, I think is probably just the addition they need. I mean, CeeDee Lamb more or less called for it the offseason, like, get us one more wide receiver, and that's going to do it for us on the offensive side of the ball. Felt a little bit sorry for Kellen Moore being the scapegoat for failures that I don't think were necessarily his. Dak just went really cold at exactly the wrong time last season as well. Like, it's not Kellen Moore's fault. He threw 2 bad picks in that game against the 49ers when, as you say, I think quite rightly, they weren't at their best, and Dallas had a shot. The Cowboys weren't great on the road last year, though, funnily enough. Like, You weren't massively confident that they were going to roll in there and do a number on the 49ers, and they had an opportunity to do it as it went. But you just wonder culturally, are they in the right place? We just finished talking about the Giants. Dayball seems to pretty much have them achieving at their potential. Cowboys, you'd say, are probably 10 or 15% off achieving what the potential in that team is. I mean, you just listen off the names on both sides of the ball, like just Pro Bowl talent or potential Pro Bowl talent pretty much everywhere you look. Like Eagles, 49ers, Cowboys, Bengals, Bills, got to be the most talented rosters in football. And the Cowboys, arguably, you could put on the top of that pile, but they're nowhere near achieving their ceiling. They have a very high ceiling, admittedly, but when it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. They look like the Keystone Cops more than they look like CSI at times.
Colin, 2 players in which they lost from free agency, which they might go under the radar, and that's Dalton Schultz, he's gone to the Texans, and McGovern, who was a really marquee player on their offensive line, gone to the Bills. But yeah, everybody seems to just talk about these 2 particular trades. I mean, they kind of regressed slightly in terms of some of the other players that have walked away that were really key to them. I know Leighton Van Der Esch has come back, and they brought the Fowler back, and it looks like Zeke might come back at some stage on a kind of reduced contract. Are we essentially going to run? Is it a run-it-back scenario?
I think in many ways it is, but what you said there in relation to Zeke encapsulates it, right? And if I'm to channel my inner Mark Cockrell and go with some Greek mythology, I think there are 2 that you can stand out, right? The legend of King Midas, where everything Midas touched turned to gold. And initially this was fantastic, and Midas was delighted, only for it to go horribly wrong. When he touched family members and they turned to gold and were lost forever. And ultimately that was Jerry Jones, right? Jerry Jones takes over as the owner. Jimmy comes in. They are super successful. They decide to move on from Jimmy because Jerry wants more of the credit. And it's like the gods decided they were going to tantalize him, because they go and they win it, right? And Jerry, I have no doubt, thinks at that point, this is going to be easy peasy. I am set. I truly am King Midas in everything I touch. But he very quickly turned into Sisyphus, who is condemned for all eternity to push the rock up the hill, only for it to roll back down again. And that is where Jerry is at. And that's where the Cowboys are at, because he cannot stay out of his own way. And there might be a curse involved there as well, because this week Jerry has once again said, no new inductees into the Cowboys Ring of Fame. So despite making a public promise on primetime television that he would induct Jimmy Johnson into the Cowboys Hall of Fame, he has once again backed away from that. And he is once again meddling in that he wants to bring back Zeke. Zeke has been the law of diminishing returns ever since that phenomenal first season. And Jerry just doesn't want to hear that. And that is the Cowboys' biggest issue. Jerry Jones. We can talk about the personnel, we can talk about the coaching, we can talk about schemes, we can talk about silly things that have gone wrong for them over the past couple of years. But it all, for me, boils down to one issue, and that is Jerry Jones. And I don't think they're going to see success until Jerry is no longer in charge.
Conor, the week of the draft, in which I think it was the draft presser, maybe 2 or 3 days out from that Thursday, and he jokingly made a comment about Mike McCarthy whilst he was sitting there about his play calling and his coaching towards the end of the season, and everybody kind of laughed in the room. But like, we had Jane Slater on the night of the draft, who does a great job for NFL Network, on the Cowboys, and she said, once it was a bit tongue-in-cheek and everybody laughed, the point was being made that if it doesn't change next season. But again, what's changed for the Cowboys? You touched on it there. They get to the promised land in terms of the playoffs, just can't get over the line. Is McCarthy going to win that kind of last chance saloon? Is it this year or bust? It has to be maybe
100%. And like this is the pattern. We see it all the time. First time the offensive coordinator gets fired or the defensive coordinator gets fired. Second time, it's your head that's on the block. It's the old write 2 letters thing. You can blame the other guy the first time around, but then you're done when it happens again. I say when, sorry, if. Don't want to be wish casting the Cowboys not to get to the promised land next year. What a terrible thing that would be to do just in June. It'll be an entertaining ride as it always is. But all the points that Colin has made about Jerry Jones absolutely tally with everything that we hear from inside and outside that camp year in, year out, that they just can't get out of their own way.
Even more entertaining during the season, Colin, when the Cowboys fans were sending us in comments during the live shows, and they're blowing their mind over how many interceptions Dak Prescott has thrown. It's look, they're always entertaining, and it's always interesting to keep an eye on what the Cowboys do. We're going to close out the NFC East review with the Eagles, and the Eagles go to the Super Bowl, and Jalen Hurts probably really should have been the MVP if it wasn't for that last drive by Mahomes. I suppose he is the MVP, and to play in a game and be so close to winning the Super Bowl and put up so many points, and yet walk away from a defeat, and as once they can hold their head high up, and we've seen in the past, Colin, where teams have gone to the Super Bowl, look like they're kind of ready to come back again, and it doesn't materialize for one reason or another. You don't get the sense with this team, bearing in mind what Howie Roseman has done during this offseason.
No, but that said, that there will be issues. To me, losing Shane Steichen is probably the biggest one, because I think Shane Steichen is a gifted coach. When you consider what he did with Justin Herbert and what he did with Jalen Hurts, it wasn't just one quarterback. Like, Herbert is phenomenal, but Herbert hasn't been as phenomenal ever since Steichen up sticks and left the Chargers. So I think that will be the big question, is around Brian Johnson and what the offense looks like. In terms of Gannon, look, this is despite the fact they got 70 sacks last year. There were murmurings of discontent from the defense throughout the year. I mean, that was what was kind of bananas about this. Now, look,
was it only 70 sacks, Colin? I thought it was like 500. Gannon giving these interviews saying they were 100 sacks ahead of the next best team.
Yeah. After 8 games or something like that, Connor, I think was a quote when he went down to Arizona. It will be difficult for them to maintain that. So no matter kind of what they do, I'm sure the spotlight will be saying they're not as effective. But you'd have to say Howie has put them in a great position. The other thing is, like, when you consider Hurts, when you look at everything he did, right, and it was so impressive. But remember that he missed, games because he was hurt, and when he came back, he still wasn't right, and he still put up that level of performance. So look, they have found their guy. They got the deal done. The camp seems happier that Gannon has moved on. Sirianni, to me, is the perfect coach, but one must beware of hubris, particularly when it comes to Philadelphia. We all remember the infamous Dream Team. They have shied away from making any pronouncements like that. And in fairness, Hurts seems to be very, very sensible. We saw him, remember, on the sideline last year when Sirianni was enjoying himself, and Hurts was the one who came over, put the arm on the shoulder and said, there's a long way to go yet, coach. So I think they're in very good hands with their GM, their head coach, and their QB. There will be those question marks, but they enter certainly this division as favourites, and rightfully so.
Connor, Hargrave goes to the Niners, Edwards goes to the Bears, 2 marquee players at the front 7. How important was it, in your opinion, that they kept hold of Slay and Bradbury in terms of the secondary? Because at one stage, Slay was being released and it looked like Bradbury wasn't going to be maintained, and came to a contract with him, and then Slay quickly signs up again. You touched on it last week. I mean, your secondary is only as good as your front 7 are doing. Do you see any scenario where there'll be a bit of a drop-off? They have brought in some other players, and whether they're at the level of those guys who have left is another thing.
I think there's 2 classic mistakes that we make in these off-season predictions, right? We either assume that too much will be different, or we assume that way too much will be the same. And the Eagles put me in that quandary where everything you're seeing suggests there's every reason that they should run it back. And then you remember that historically that's not the way it goes. Only 2 teams in NFL history have ever lost the Super Bowl and come back to win one the following season. The Patriots did it obviously relatively recently, ironically having lost to the Eagles, came back the next year and beat the Rams. The previous team to do it was Don Shula's unbeaten 72 Dolphins. It does not happen that often, and it doesn't happen for a reason. It's really, really difficult to do. And you touched on part of the reason, Colin. When you make a big run like the Eagles did, your coordinators tend to come up for grabs, and they're going to get head coaching jobs, as the Eagles have seen. I totally agree with you. I think Steichen is the bigger loss than Gannon there. It's funny to think, for all of the praise that we and others have given Howie Roseman, they could have played last season with Russell Wilson, it turned out. One of the more entertaining stories of the offseason was the potential Russell Wilson trade to the Eagles that in the end didn't happen, and I'm sure Eagles fans are delighted, given how last season played out, that it didn't. You'd find it hard to see that the Eagles aren't going to make a deep run, though. All things being equal, and if everybody stays healthy, and health was something that, in large part, they could rely on last year, as pretty much every team that makes a deep playoff run has going for them. It's nearly always the healthiest teams. You correlate the healthy teams and the talented teams, and it's health that gets you the extra mile and gets you over the hump in the playoffs. People were kind of putting Jalen Hurts down at a certain point last season, saying, well, anybody could win with that team around them. But then Gardner Minshew came in, and they weren't performing at anything like the same level. So Hurts has been huge for them. He's made that huge progress for them, and we want to see him at 100% health this season. I think that they start off like a juggernaut. I don't think that Roseman's probably his biggest achievement during the offseason has been that they didn't lose a lot of the names in free agency that we thought that they might, and that was a big question mark over them. They seem to have, in fact, added a little bit of strength. The additions that he's made have had people scratch their heads going, how did they get that guy? The likes of DeAndre Swift coming in. He's made some clever moves. But what got you to the top of the mountain or near the top of the mountain last year isn't going to be enough to get there this year. So they need to do better, and they need to do more. And I think Sirianni's up for that fight. He seems to me like the kind of guy who's not gonna by any means rest on that laurels. They were so tantalizingly close. Put up that kind of performance offensively in the Super Bowl, undone the way they were. It's a tough beat to take, and I think I expect them to be thereabouts again this season. But it's again historically a really tough thing to do.
Colin, when Conor Rogers from NBC was on the show, he said if it wasn't for the off-field stuff that went on, Jalen Carter was the standout player in this draft, and Eagles find a way to pick him. They moved from 10 up to 9 with the Bears to pick him up. They then get Nolan Smith at 30, two Georgia players, Keely Ringo, who was supposed to be going off for a lot earlier than which he did. Like, is he essentially looking at him as the most pro-ready college and will pick those players, or do you think it's just a fortune of events how these things played out, or do you think they really did home in on Georgia?
I think they did, but I think it's a number of things. Like, we've seen it before, and the Eagles have done it before. It's not just Georgia. They like to bring in a number of players from a particular college, and they do that because they think it helps guys to settle into the league, and it helps the cohesion. So I think that the fact that Georgia are so historically good, right, and take the LSU offense, right, Joe Burrow, Justin Jefferson, Ja'Marr Chase, they've done pretty well in the league. And so if you look at that, and you look at the Georgia defense, you can understand why they're doing it. And the fact is that the guys last year who they brought in have now had a year to transition, to learn from the players, and they've been very smart in their ability to do that, right? And go to Sue, right, a player who is known for being super nasty, right? I think if you talk to a lot of NFL fans, that's the thing that stands out. But he is such a deep thinker, and when you hear teammates talk about him and his willingness to work with them, to teach them, to mentor them, that's what they've done. They've done the same with Jurgens, who they brought in on the O-line. They have been very clever about bringing guys in, not having to over-rely on them. Now, injury plays a huge part in that. They have been fortunate. That is the ultimate wild card. But I can see why they have leaned in to Georgia. There's a reason that Georgia were so successful, and that defense was star-studded. And now we get to see what that looks like in the NFL, and it's it's like they've gone for, I suppose, Jordan Davis, who is such a kind of a physical freak, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word. Like this is a human being who shouldn't move like at a size, who moves at speeds that human beings shouldn't move at. And then you've got, say, Nakobe Dean, who is known for being such a cerebral player and a real quarterback of the defense. So yeah, they've been very, very smart. But I said it time and time and time again, you don't know what the transition into the league looks like. And yeah, there are certainly concerns around Jalen Carter and maturity, alongside everything else regarding the car accident and the people who lost their lives.
I can't recall how many years it is now since one team has won back-to-back NFC East. I think we're going back maybe 15, 16 years. And in an era where it's a 40% strike rate of teams that make the playoffs going back the following year, it'd be interesting to see if 3 teams come back out of the NFC East this year. Interesting times ahead in this division. That is our NFC East recap of the offseason. Colin, Connor, I appreciate your time. Thank you.